Welcome everyone to the launch of the 2020 OECD Economic Survey of Greece. We have a slot of an hour and a half for the presentation and the discussion. The introduction to the survey will be done, and we are very honored to have him with us, by Alvaro Pereira, who is the head of the country studies at OECD. I anticipate he's going to talk to us about the Greek economy in the context of the current COVID crisis, but also in comparison with what is happening in Europe, in the OECD area, but also touching upon structural issues in the Greek economy, including recommendations that the OECD often puts on the table. The details of the study are going to be presented first by Mauro Pisu, and then Tim Bulman is going to talk more about the issues related to the labor market. Following the presentation, we are going to have two local discussions. Ilias Lekkos, who is the head of research at Piraeus, as well as Daphne Nicolitsas, who is an assistant professor at the University of Crete, also here in Greece, of course. So without any, people will be able to send questions to the participants, to the panel participants, via the chat option. And I will then try to organize them as needed and, if appropriate, pass to the various participants. So without any further ado, Alvaro, the floor is yours, and we are very excited and looking forward to hear what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Nikos. Good morning, everyone. I would like to first say hi to my team as well, and thank them for the great work that they did in order to get this survey out, but also the Greek delegation represented by Ambassador Prevalakis, who has been doing an outstanding job supporting Greece and also putting us in our toes in the OECD and trying to ask the OECD also to support Greece and their reform efforts. Obviously, the ideal situation, and when we were doing this survey, everybody was thinking of doing this in a very different circumstances. Not only we were hoping to be in Athens presenting this there, but also we were expecting that we will be talking about something that we think it was quite remarkable, which is basically Greece was on its recovery and certainly on the right track. And then suddenly we have this pandemic, which is affecting not only Greece, but everybody else, and is putting us back to crisis mode once again, in very different circumstances, of course. We can talk about later on about the European response and how things have been totally different, I think, quite different from the previous crisis in terms of European response, but we'll talk also about But before I start talking about Greece, I think it's important to put things into context and remember, this is a shock like we haven't seen probably certainly since 1918. And in terms of economic shock, we haven't seen anything similar since the Great Depression. But this is a shock that basically is both a demand shock, a traditional crisis, which will have ramifications also in the financial sector, but also it's a supply shock. So, and almost everybody around the world, and certainly most countries, are being affected by this shock. Just to give you an idea, we follow directly more than 50 countries around the world, from New Zealand to Greece to many in Latin America and many other parts of the world. And every single economy we are forecasting in the last economic outlook is in the red, right? So we're talking about a massive drop in GDP all around the world, but also a massive drop in per capita income. And so what are we going to see, besides being a demand shock and supply shock, we are going to see an income shock for a lot of families and a lot of businesses. And this shock, I think we're just starting to see the early consequences. But I think that after past the summer, come September, October, we'll start unfortunately seeing more and more around the world quite of the bad consequences of the pandemic and the measures taken to try to control the pandemic, which will include again a rise in unemployment, and very likely in a few months' time, unfortunately, a rise in insolvencies, which will lead to further problems down the line. But we can talk about that a bit later. So today we are talking about Greece first, and then we can, as Nico said, we can talk a bit more after the European response and the context of the world economy. But what are the main messages of the survey? First of all, we know that Greece, and as a highlight, Greece has been kind of a model in terms of response to the COVID shock, at least the early response. Again, the most important thing for Greece is not to be complacent. I'll give you a really far away and historic example to see how you should not be complacent. In the 1919 pandemic, Australia did extremely well in the first wave of the pandemic, right? So in the spring 1918, they did extremely well, but then they relaxed. And when they relaxed, and afterwards, you know, in the second wave of the pandemic, Australia was one of the most affected ones. So, and you can see this in many parts of the world, this has happened, right? So from Israel to a few other countries, in the first wave of the pandemic, they did very well, but then they relaxed a little bit, and then, you know, things were not so controlled. So I think it's important, even though you did extremely well first, it's important to continue to not to be complacent, to track, trace, and diagnose any possible outbreaks so that you stop the sanitary challenge going forward. But besides responding well to the COVID in terms of sanitary, we know that there's been a policy response. We praise the policy response of Greece in the last few months. And so we think it has been appropriate, and it's important to continue to extend exceptional support for households and firms, boost job search and training policies. This will be key. So we think that active labor market policies will be key in the following months for not only for the most vulnerable, but basically for the people that will become unemployed and the long-term unemployed, but also enhancing access to family care to boost opportunities is something that the OECD has been saying for a while, and reiterate this even more with a bit more pressing, because we think this is quite important. And we'll talk a little bit more as well about public finances, productivity, and job creation. In terms of public finances, this is a major shock, as I said, drop in GDP at the same time that governments are forced to spend more. So instead of having a budget surplus like you've been witnessing in the last few years, obviously you'll go back to deficits, but everybody's going back to deficits and large deficits. And also, as it happens around the world, we expect that public debt around the world will go up by 15, 20 percentage points of GDP. So a substantial increase for almost every single country. And Greece will not be an exception. So obviously this poses challenges going forward. We'll talk about productivity, job creation, and well-being. And so Mauro and Tim will talk a bit later about these issues as well. But as I said, and these graphs show, I hope you are able to see the slides well. The graph shows that, after the very large crisis that we had after the financial and sovereign debt crisis, Greece was on its way to recovery. And in fact, you could see that they were starting to converge, when now you start having basically a decline in real GDP per capita, both in Greece, but also in the OECD. And we expect this will certainly happen in 2020. And it depends whether or not we're going to have one or two virus outbreaks in 2020 or 21 to see what happens afterwards. But as I said, in terms of response, a sanitary response to the crisis, Greece responded very swiftly and very well, limiting the death toll compared to many other countries. I don't need to show you all and explain all these graphs because you've seen them before for sure. But what matters is that the crisis interrupts the recovery and creates uncertainty that is really exceptional. So I think if we want to characterize this crisis with a couple of words, is basically pervasive uncertainty. We don't know what will happen in the next few months. We don't know yet. And for the first time in its history, the OECD, because of this pervasive uncertainty, the OECD decided to go with two base scenarios in their forecast of the economic outlook. One scenario in which the virus, there's one outbreak and then subsides slowly, but subsides in the next few months. And then the second scenario, we go back to the 1918, remember the pandemic in 1918 was 3 years, 1918 to 1920. And the pandemic came in several waves. In one of the waves, the second one was the worst. And so we are assuming that there might be a second wave. And the second wave will not lead to strict lockdowns as before, but will lead to regional lockdowns, will lead to activity lockdowns. So, but will have a negative impact again on the economic activity. And this is reflected on this graph. So basically the blue / black line is, real GDP in the last few years. But then you have the green line, which is one scenario, the scenario where the virus comes back. So there's a sharp drop in GDP, recovers a little bit now in the summer, then it goes down again late in the year when there's a second outbreak. And the other possibility is what we call the single hit scenario. There's a protracted long-term, recovery, and in which there's only one virus outbreak. So, what matters is that we don't know, certainly, what will happen in the next few months. And so pervasive uncertainty means that it's difficult to forecast what's going on. And this is what these forecasts of the OECD reflect. In terms of responding to COVID shock, very important, and I think Mauro and Tim will talk more about this. I think the key for Greece, especially knowing that resources are at the premium in many ways, very important is to try to reduce the poverty rate through social transfers. You can see in this graph that basically, there's work to do in terms of better targeting income support to reduce the most vulnerable, or the poorest. And so we'll talk a bit later about how can you do this and what is the best way of doing it. The other issue is obviously unemployment. The graph on the left shows you basically employment rates in the OECD and Greece. Employment rates fell dramatically after the onset of the crisis, and they're expected to recover slowly, both in Greece and the OECD, but certainly this is a big shock. So, in Greece, obviously the unemployment rate went down from 28 to it was already around 16 and on the way down, but now we expect it will go up. But in the OECD, in many countries, we were talking about historically low unemployment. So many countries around the world had really low unemployment, at least the lowest since the 70s. And right now, it has a massive increase in unemployment, like countries like the United States and a few others. Many countries, you don't see already the huge increase in unemployment because they decided to introduce short-time work schemes. So basically people are laid off and they stayed in the companies, but the state pays part of their salaries or all their salaries. So this is helping to mitigate the unemployment problem for a few months. But obviously, the longer the crisis stays, the less likely we will remain with this short-time work scheme. So likely, the unemployment figures will start showing up a bit further. The employment rates, not only the unemployment, the employment rates also went down because a lot of people went out of the workforce. So labor force participation declined. And so this will also have a substantial impact. On the right-hand side, you can see the spending per unemployed in labor market policies. And you can see that Greece spends a lot less than many other countries. In part, this has to be a reflection of the Troika years, right? So in which there was clearly a need to reduce expenditures, and in part, easiest way is public investment and to spend less with active labor market policies. So in part, this is explained by this, but also it's historic. So basically, we think that this is an area in which more can be done, especially because we expect that unemployment, unfortunately, will come back to Greece and other countries of the OECD. Another thing that we talk quite a lot in this survey is about the need to invest in childhood education. You can see on the left-hand side, enrollment rates in early childhood education are much lower in Greece than most countries of the OECD. Of course, you have Switzerland, that is the outlier, but Switzerland is really the outlier for a variety of cultural reasons. But most other countries have much higher enrollment rates in early childhood education. Even Switzerland, by the way, they are investing a lot now into early childhood education because they know that it's not sustainable what they have there. So we believe that investing more in early childhood education is crucial, even to help parents going back to work during the COVID crisis. But also in terms of what you can see on the right-hand side is that care personnel per 1,000 population is fairly low. So investing in more carers, we believe this is quite important in the next few years, so that, again, you have a more resilient recovery, but also you have as Mauro and Tim are going to talk about, a more just society and less inequalities going forward, because there'll be more opportunities as well for the neo generation. Something that I think is key, and listen, we are doing this, unfortunately, we are not in Athens to launch this survey, but at least we have the opportunity right now, which would not be possible 10 years ago, of using electronic platforms to do the seminars and the releases of surveys and many other things. But I think, you know, if there is one silver lining for this crisis, I really think that the silver lining has to be a substantial acceleration of the digital transition. I think the way of work, the way that we work, the way that we travel, but especially using the digital technologies will change. Many things will stay the same in 3 or 4 years. I think the digital will not. There was already a digital transition ongoing. The crisis substantially accelerated it. And so this has massive consequences for what will happen in the future. So first of all, we know that there is still a huge digital divide between some people, you know, even our own kids, when they go to schools. Many kids have access to online courses, but many other kids don't have computers or internet at home. And it sounds difficult for many of us in this seminar certainly to believe, but this is true. And so the digital divide has to be bridged. It has to be reduced dramatically. But we think, and this graph shows where the share of individuals scoring in problem-solving skills in technology-rich environments. Basically, you can see that Greece is not doing well. And so Greece has to invest more in digital skills, not only to diminish the digital divide, but also to catch up with what some other countries are doing. Not everything is, don't think that you've been singled out. I give an example. You know, Germany, for example, we've been singling them out, not for the digital skills. So they have the skills, but they don't have the infrastructure. So for many years, we've been saying to the Germans, listen, how can you, you know, a massively advanced country, still have a digital infrastructure that is way worse than many other countries that are a lot poorer than you? So they'll need to invest more on the digital infrastructure. You need to invest more in digital skills. And I think this is going to be key. And again, you know, to seize the opportunities given by this crisis, including on global value chains, I think this is key. The digital area is going to be key the next few years. And so it's important that the government, you know, invests a lot in this area. Another thing that we talked for years and years is obviously the health of the banks. You can see on the left-hand side that the non-performing loans were starting to come down. They're still very high, as you can see on the right-hand side. The right-hand side compares Greece with all the other OECD countries. Greece still has very, very high non-performing loans for a variety of reasons. We think that the program that was launched recently, Hercules, has good potential and should be accelerated. But you can see the non-performing loans were starting to come down for consumers, for residential, but also business loans. However, this crisis, for sure, not only in Greece, but in many other countries, will lead to substantial challenges in terms of the banking sector once again. Because what will happen is that countries like Greece, Portugal, Spain, and many others, and France, tourism is very, very important. And now we are facing a circumstance in which there are less tourists, you know, less opportunities for Airbnb, local tourism, and so on and so on. And so what will happen is that, unfortunately, it's very likely that there'll be a rise in insolvencies. in many of these sectors, hotel, hospitality, and many other sectors. And as a consequence, we would not be surprised that non-performing loans in these sectors will start rising again. And so this will pose an additional challenge to Greece, because obviously, as you all know very well, the health of the banks has been an issue for years and years. And now that things were starting to improve, you know, you get this hit, global hits that will not help the recovery, okay? And so we'll have plenty of recommendations of how to support people and how to respond to the COVID shock. I won't go through them because otherwise you'll get bored to death. And so the next step will be to talk about Greece's long-term challenges. But since I've taken such a long time already, we'll stop here. And then after we have the discussants, Tim and Mauro will talk about also the long-term challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Alvaro, so much for this overview, but including, you know, I would say most of the main points. Before we go to Mauro, who is going to fill in a lot of the key details, let me just comment that you highlighted that yes, Greece has done well in the. You were very careful to stress that this has been the first wave of fighting the pandemic, that no country can think that we are out of the woods yet. And then on top of that, to think about the long-term issues in Greece and basically affecting the three key areas, which is labor participation, capital and investment, and of course, productivity. So I'm sure we can discuss all this later on, but now let me give the floor to Mauro, who I'm sure is going to add a lot of interesting details in this picture.
Okay, thank you, Nikos. Thank you, Alvaro. Good morning to everybody. I'm going to share my screen to continue the presentation. Let me try if I manage. Okay, for this light. Can you see it, or can you see it? Is okay?
Now, yes.
Okay.
Although, Mauro, perhaps you can make it like full screen, full view.
Okay, let me see. Okay, one moment. Let me do this. One moment. Let me stop sharing.
Slideshow, and then just see.
Yeah. No, let me stop sharing one moment.
Otherwise, I can do it, Mauro.
It's okay. The fact is that I have two screen. Apologies for this. Okay, share screen.
What were we just saying about digital skills?
Can you see now, or?
I guess it's fine like this. If you want it, I guess you can do slideshow, but it's also fine like this.
Yeah, but I did it, and to be honest, I don't know why.
I believe it's.
Let me try. Okay. I think this is fine. Let me go to that.
Yes, now it's large and clear.
Yeah, apologies for this. Okay, so just to carry on with what Alvaro said, Alvaro has pointed out the big challenge that Greece, but also many other countries are facing in trying to revive the recovery. And as usual, the survey also point out the long-term challenges that Greece is facing. What's different this time compared to previous surveys is that is the COVID shock. So the COVID shock can be interpreted as a temporary shock, but this will have most probably long-term effect. So not only in Greece, but also in many other countries, the COVID-19 shock can amplify the long-term challenges that country face. Alvaro already mentioned some of them. This can be non-performing loans, they can be digital skills, but there are many others. We are going to touch on some of them in the next 20 minutes. The main point that we want to make is that the governments and the government of Greece is right, obviously, to focus on dealing on the emergency, but it's important also to adapt the emergency measure and to continue the reform process to tackling the long-term challenges. I mean, the OECD is trying fundamentally to urge government to keep an eye on the long term and not just be on an emergency mode. Also because of political cycle, it's important to keep an eye on the long-term growth prospects. And in the survey, we propose a specific sorry for that. We propose a set of policy reforms that will drive growth higher over the medium long term. This graph shows the effect of this reform over the very long term. We have a baseline scenario that is based mainly on the reform of on the 2021 policy setting. Then we have a recommended reforms program, and we can see that the blue line is steeper than the red line, that is the baseline. And so the recommended reform program, according to our model, can also accelerate growth. And one other aspect that we point out is the importance of raising population growth and raising fundamentally the working age population. This may happen through higher fertility rate now, but most likely also through better integration of immigrants in the Greece labor market. This is an especially important point over the medium long term because of population dynamics. The working age population of Greece will start declining, I think, around 2030 to 2035, and this will have really detrimental effect on growth. So it's important as well to try to reverse to this decrease in the working age population. Concerning the policy package, that is here, this slide shows the ambitious policy package that we propose to the Greek government. That is partly also is consistent with the government reform program. This built on the previous work we did that we did for the previous surveys. And in a nutshell, we can divide the main policy reforms that we recommend to this government in three main areas. The first one are policies that support employment and inclusiveness. So these involve reducing the labor income tax wedge that is high, as Alvaro has already pointed out as well. Tim will elaborate a bit more later on this. There is scope to strengthen the social protection system to make it more targeted and more effective in reducing inequality. According to our models, inequality can have a detrimental effect on growth because a high degree of inequality fundamentally lower the purchasing power of lower income people, and this may have a detrimental effect on growth. And also the family benefit, family care, as Alvaro has already pointed out, can have a big positive impact and effect on growth because of the increase in job opportunities that this kind of policies may generate, especially for women that are really more involved than men in family care obligation. A second sector reform concerns the policy to invest the investment climate, and according to our model, all the reforms involving the efficiency of the public administration judicial system a very large positive effect on growth. Okay, this is not only in Greece, but across a very large range of countries. Why these policies have a big impact on growth? Because in the end, the public administration, according also to what firms say, business says, one of the inefficiency of the public administration is one of the main obstacles firms face in their business operation. Inefficiency of the public administration in Greece, but also elsewhere, this is not just a problem concerning Greece, raise business cost, create delays, and so on and so forth, and make Greece a less attractive place where to do business. And our simulation saw that improvement in this area can increase investment and can increase also productivity. Both of them. This for the reason that there is a positive impact of growth over 2030, 2040, 2050. And the last, broad policy reform set that we want to highlight is the need to boost investment in infrastructure, knowledge, and human capital. This fundamentally involves increasing the stock of physical and knowledge-based capital stock. We propose to increase public investment spending by 4% to 4% of GDP by 2030, gradually but steadily. We propose to strengthen incentives for R&D, and I think a team can say something a bit more about that. And over the long term, improving the quality of schooling, the quality of adult skill training, and so on and so forth, can provide a big help in boosting the human capital of the country. That is, we're very aware that in Greece there are excellent universities, but there is quite a sort of, the human capital, if we want to speak like this, is quite unequally distributed, because not all people have access to the excellent education that some university or some schools can provide in Greece. And the aim here is would be to increase the average, if you want to say, of the training and education opportunities that young and adult people can have. So over the long term, over the medium long term, this policy can have a substantial effect on living standard, on employment, and productivity. Going a bit, speaking about what kind of effects this policy may have on growth. Obviously, we're interested in reforms just because these reforms will boost GDP growth, and this means living standards and wealth, and social welfare and well-being. But obviously, boosting growth will be also important to put the public debt ratio on a downward path. As Alvaro has already pointed out, the public debt of Greece, like in many other countries, shot up during the COVID crisis. So this year and the next year, this big increase is not really due to the fiscal expansion, to the necessary fiscal support measure that governments have put in place, but actually this big spike in the public debt ratio has been caused by the steep drop in nominal GDP. Okay, by the numerator in the public debt ratio, in the GDP to debt ratio. So, according to our simulation, reforms will put the public debt ratio on a steady, a gradual downward path over the medium term. And this is also the best way to raise living standard and to manage public finance, obviously, in a sustainable basis. Our reforms cover many aspects, but probably one, the common denominator of these reforms, probably what would help Greece to accelerate growth, is to allow small firms, the many small firms that are the backbone of Greece economy, to allow these firms to expand and to flourish and to increase employment. Greece is characterized by a huge number of small firms, often unproductive firms. And this graph, for instance, showed that a share of limited liability enterprise, that in Greece, that is the largest enterprise in general, are lower than elsewhere. And some other statistics that we have that we don't show here, showing, for instance, the share of firms the share of firms employing less than 10 employees or micro firms. This kind of firms are much more common in Greece than elsewhere, and these firms tend to be in general slowly productive. So removing all those obstacles that discourage firms from growing and expand employment and become more productive, that's the first policy objective that the government should pursue. Obviously, this is a policy objective, a policy outcome. What are, in the end, the actual policy changes that the government should implement to achieve this objective? Well, one of the things that we point out in the survey, among many other things, is to continue the reforms in concerning product market restriction. Okay, Greece has made a very large progress over the past few years in product market regulation. On the left-hand side of this graph, you can see how the overall PMR index for Greece decreased substantially from 2013 to today. Today, Greece is close to the OECD average. And this gain has been driven to a large extent by improvement in the management of state-owned enterprises, public ownership. This is the second set of columns starting from the left. Public ownership has improved substantially over the past few years, and especially also there has been a huge improvement in Greece in the administrative burden on startup. Greece has made, I think Greece now has one of the least burdensome procedure to open businesses, new startups across all the 6 countries. And this shows the improvement that can be made in this area doing the adequate policy changes. So these are the 2 components that have driven mainly the progress in PMR, and obviously we congratulate the government on this. And there's been instead less progress concerning product market restrictions of liberal profession and professional services. As we can see here, the product market restrictions for lawyers, for notaries, for to a less extent architects, engineers, are still pronounced, and there is much scope to lower these kind of restrictions. Why we focus on these kind of restrictions? Well, that's because this kind of services, lawyers, notaries, are an input to the operation of many other firms. So restrictions in this kind of professional services raise cost for doing business in Greece. So doing reforms in this area and further easing on product market relation in this area can substantially lower the cost of doing business in Greece. Now I stop here. I believe this is and I let Team Bulman continue this presentation. Team, I will change slide as you tell me to proceed.
Thanks, Mauro, and thanks, Alvaro, and thanks, Lekkos, for organizing the seminar. So I'll pick up right on this point here, which is one of the ways, one of the elements that we think would support small firms flourishing and also be essential for Greece's recovery from the COVID shock. So this slide focuses on one aspect of the court system, which is the time it takes to resolve a case, a litigious case, a dispute. And you can see across OECD European countries, Greece is second only to Italy. This is just the time to resolve these cases in the first instance. We're highlighting this because we think...
Can I get in the middle for a second? Can you speak a little bit closer to the mic? I think the sound is a little bit too soft. Or speak a little bit louder.
Okay. Is this better?
I think it's a bit better. Yes, thank you.
Okay, apologies. So we're highlighting this slide, this indicator of the performance of the judicial system, because this is one of the things that's going to be very important in the COVID response. Alvaro has already mentioned the risk that the shock is going to have of increasing the number of firms which are insolvent. What's going to be essential is that there are insolvency processes that allow these firms to emerge as going operations, perhaps as changed operations, but as ongoing operations, in terms of limiting the ongoing the cost from this crisis. When the judicial system is slow, sorry, I've got feedback. When the judicial system is slow, that makes it less likely that these firms are going to re-emerge as ongoing concerns. One way to improve the speed of the judicial system would be through pursuing the digitalization program. Digital tools. Sorry, Mauro, could you mute, please? I think. Or Nicolitsas. So the digitalization, this is quite appropriate that we have technological problems as I talk about digitalization, but the digitalization of public administration, which the government's pursuing, can help speed up court processes, for example, through electronic management of court documents, through processes that speed up how quickly courts can handle cases. Other ways to do this as well would be to discourage cases from actually going to court through the use of alternative dispute resolution systems. And more can be done in Greece to communicate the benefits of alternative dispute resolution and to encourage litigants to pursue that. It's lower costs, it can work more effectively than going through formal courts. And finally, as well, within the judicial system, ensuring that the people working in the system are trained and understand the issues, for example, in insolvency cases, and also for the speed with which they deal with those cases. Related to this, to the next slide. So that's one aspect of how you can support investment in firms flourishing. If we go to the next slide, you'll see another aspect, which is supporting investment in research and development. Greece has a large number of schemes which are available to help support R&D, to support patenting, to support research and adopting technologies from other countries. The problem is that in Greece, a lot of these schemes are not taken up. You can see this on the panel on the right here, which shows the amount of expenditure or the value of government support for research and development activities. And this in part reflects take-up or access to these schemes, the administration of these schemes, the complexity of the schemes, all the different programs which are available. And the consequence of this, or one of the consequences, is what you see on the left graph, on the left panel, which is a relatively low share of spending on research and development. A point perhaps worth highlighting here is that this is not an advocacy for frontier research. This is saying that there are many fields where firms in Greece over recent years have proved that they can be competitive. So, for example, think of the success of some of the pharmaceutical exporters in recent years. But what's required is some investment in identifying the best technologies which are available and adapting them to production processes in Greece. And this is one of the things that can help support diversification of the economy as Greece comes out of this COVID shock. If we go to the next slide. this is the point that Mauro has mentioned as well, which is the importance of the labour income tax wedge. So what we're doing here in our analysis is we take into account income tax rates, but also the cost for employers and for employees of social security contributions. And we work with our colleagues in different directorates of the OECD, putting together models which combine all these different contributions, income taxes, as well as taking into account some social benefits that households can receive depending on their circumstances. Combining all those, we can do this analysis that we'll look at in this slide and the next slide, which compares countries on a if we go back to the previous one, on a like-for-like basis in terms of the overall difference between what households receive in terms of their net income and what it costs to employ those employees. So this perhaps this graph makes the most basic point, which is comparing the overall labour income tax wedge at a relatively modest wage. So this is 50% of the average wage, which I think for Greece in 2019 is about 11,000 euros per year. And you can see even at a modest salary, the labour income tax wedge in Greece is high. Why does this matter? It matters because it discourages people moving into employment, because you think we've mentioned already the costs to households if the second earner moves into employment when there's very little childcare or care for elderly family members. And it adds to the cost of employers from creating additional jobs. Then, if we go to the next slide, we can then look at the impact this has on the types of jobs that are created. What we're doing here, this is a little bit more complex, and this is some relatively new work that we're doing with our colleagues in the tax directorate of the OECD, where we look at the overall labour tax wedge for different employment types. Mauro's mentioned how in Greece there's a very large share of employees or people who are either self-employed or working for very small firms. And so the question that we asked is, does that reflect incentives that are created by the tax system? What we see is that for self-employed, so if you look on the left of the graph, above the dashed line, which indicates the minimum full-time wage, the overall effective tax rate becomes really high, very high, because there is a minimum assumed income that self-employed are earning, and on that basis they have to make a fixed number of euros contribution to social security contribution. And this assumed level of income means that for people to declare their income effectively up to that level, they lose a very large share of that income. What we see as well is various circumstantial indicators that suggest that when the tax wedge is high for dependent employees, this creates an incentive for people to become self-employed, because it can be harder for the tax authorities to track the overall income of the self-employed, and it becomes easier, or there are indicators that suggest that it's easier for the self-employed to underreport their overall income. We can see this when we compare the income levels of self-employed in the tax returns versus what we can see, for example, in the SILK survey of household income. Now, this encourages firms to stay small. It encourages workers to either be self-employed or work for very small firms. This works against investment in higher productivity. This also works, as we see this effect at the moment with the COVID shock, against people moving into workplaces which can offer greater protection through the sort of economic shock that we're experiencing at the moment. Across OECD countries, it's the self-employed who tend to be most affected by the loss of activity that COVID is causing at the moment. Another point that we make with this graph, and there's much more detailed analysis in the survey, is, okay, so there are issues at the left hand of the distribution of income levels, but there's also a question of what happens at the right hand, particularly for liberal professionals who are high income. Does the tax system create incentives for them to design their employment structure, the legal form that they take, in a way that will minimize their tax liabilities? Does it create a bias in the type of institutional form that they take? And what we see is that for liberal professionals, so lawyers, doctors, those types, who have a very high income, there's an incentive in the tax system to incorporate and to draw their income as dividends, for example, rather than as labour income. And our argument is that a good tax system is one that is neutral between different types of employment, so that you're indifferent between whether or not you incorporate or you work as a level professional self-employed. And this is also another issue that we highlight in the survey, where we make some detailed recommendations on this. Given the time, perhaps if I move to the next slide. Okay, so this is perhaps taking a much longer term perspective, and it connects, I think, nicely to where we started by talking about the COVID shock. There are a lot of uncertainties about COVID, its epidemiological aspects. One thing where there does seem to be more consensus is that air pollution seems to increase the risk of infection. And we know already, even before this shock, one of the health for most Greeks, life expectancy, most health indicators are good. One point of weakness is exposure to air pollution in the main urban areas, particularly Athens, and the effect that that has on health. The graph on the right makes this point, that there's a higher share of the population in Greece is exposed to microparticles than in most other OECD countries. One of the things that contributes to this is that fossil fuel subsidies are relatively high. So these are subsidies, for example, for fossil fuels for shipping, but also in terms of the heating income support. What we argue is that income support for vulnerable households should not be directed through mechanisms that encourage fossil fuel consumption, but which are neutral about what type of energy use, or even discourage energy use such as fossil fuels, which have this large externality. So, for example, the fossil fuel subsidies could be redirected to boosting the guaranteed minimum income in a way that's targeted at households that would suffer from an increase in fossil fuel prices. And it could be targeted or redirected towards, for example, helping households insulate so that they don't need so much heating. This would support well-being. This would be more efficient fiscally. This would improve health outcomes and well-being into the long term. And so perhaps that's a good place to end this presentation and to move on to the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. We are now moving to some initial short discussion points by Ilias, Lekkos, and Daphne Nicolitsas. Let me, however, having heard all three of the OECD representatives, let me just state an initial remark, which I don't know if any of you would like to pick up now or perhaps leave for later. So, hearing from Alvaro, then to Mauro, then to Tim, there was a connecting line, which, if one would like to summarize in one word, is reforms. And many people in Greece would turn to you three or to the OECD collectively and ask again, haven't we tried this for 10 years? And if it succeeded, it succeeded. If it didn't succeed, it didn't. But, why are you bringing a reforms agenda again? Is it the time for this? Now with another crisis? If you know what I mean. I don't know if, Alvaro, you want to say 5 words on this?
Yes, I do, if I can. Quite an important question. Of course, reforms got a bad name during the financial crisis. I was Minister of the Economy and Employment of Portugal during this period. So I think I understand fairly well what Greece went through and how difficult it is to do reforms. And to me, so we were undertaking really historic reforms on the labor market, on product market and competition and so on. And I remember very often we would launch a reform. The following day, the Ministry of Finance would announce they were cutting wages and they were cutting pensions. you know, other austerity measures. And people forgot immediately about the fantastic reforms we were doing. So reforms were very important for Greece, were very important for Portugal, were very important for many other countries. But reforms got a bad name because of the austerity, okay? And so this is a different story here. Because of the European response, which we can talk later, but also because this is a different, you know, it's a different crisis. Probably I'm not sure for Greece, I don't think for Greece is going to be as severe as before, because for Greece it was really severe the previous crisis. But for most countries, it will be more severe this time around. However, we are all in the same boat. Whereas in 2011, 2010, Greece, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and a few others were singled out for bad policies from the past, and so now you need to pay, right? So it's a bit different type of attitude. But right now, what matters is what type of reforms make sense for Greece. This is, I think, what we need to debate, right? And this is what we're trying to talk about in this survey. We think that the reforms that you need right now is things that you've been talking for decades, which is how can you improve your public administration? How can you improve basically the justice system? How can you become less bureaucratic to attract more investment? So we're not talking about cutting wages and salaries and pensions. We are talking about how can you make the life of your citizens, right? And for the state to work better, how can you become more efficient? Just to, if I can add just a couple of things, your second part of your question was, is it the time for reforms? Well, listen, to cut bureaucracy, I think any time is good, right? So if you're going to simplify procedures so that you have lowest barriers to entrepreneurship or low barriers to investment, bringing more national and international investment, listen, cutting bureaucracy, simplifying bureaucracy, I think this is always a good time for reform. I would concentrate right now on those things rather than doing stuff that is more difficult. In 4 or 5 months' time, perhaps there'll be more politically easier to do other stuff, but right now I would concentrate on things that I think people are really fed up and would like to see changes in their lives. And if you could tackle those issues, I think would be great. And then we can talk about competition and so on a bit further down the line and the other issues that are a bit more complicated. But I think right now I would concentrate on that. And obviously right now what would the key is support to families and support the economy. I think this is what you need so that you don't have unnecessary insolvencies and that you don't go back to the terrible situation that we had a few years ago in which people felt that they were, you know, they were kind of abandoned and did not have enough support. So I think that's what I would concentrate right now. Nikos, you're on mute.
Yes, I guess the OECD administrator is muting me when they feel I'm not going to say something pleasant. Let's go to Ilias Lekkos directly. Ilia, in a few minutes, your remarks to the survey.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me thank the OECD, but especially IOBE for inviting me to participate in this very interesting discussion. And of course, reading the OECD report, and I had the privilege to receive the report a couple of days in advance, you realize that it is a very well researched and very well thought of report. So there's not a lot to say in ways of criticism or sort of any kind of critique of the report. So what I want to do is to take advantage of my time and basically shed some new light into issues that are being mentioned upon in the report. The first issue that I would like to comment upon has to do with OECD's macroeconomic scenario. And of course, Mr. Pereira mentioned that these are more of scenario rather than forecasts, and I fully agree with that point of view, because I hope that my boss is not attending the call, but I don't have any problem admitting that I have very little conviction about what's going to happen to the Greek economy this year or next. Nevertheless, what I really think that we should do, and I have very strong feelings about that, is that we should spend more time ourselves understanding the implications of our scenario. And one way to do that is basically to compare the pre-COVID world with the post-COVID one. So if I were asked my opinion, basically late last year or the beginning of this year, what I think about, the growth prospects of the Greek economy, I would reply by saying that, I believe that over the next 2-3 years, the Greek economy can grow marginally above 2%, like 2.2, 2.3% for 2-3 years, and then growth would gradually slow down to something between 1 and 1.5%, having a view about, Greek potential GDP growth to the tune of 1.3%. Now, if we compare that view with, let's say, OECD's single hit scenario, where GDP declines by 8% this year, grows by 4.5% next year, and then I assume that GDP can grow based on the 2020 budget policy scenario to the tune of, let's say, 2%, all the way to the end of my forecasting horizon, which coincides with the end of the European Commission's budget period, which is 2027, then if you compare the GDP that would accumulate to the Greek economy from 2020 to 2027, the difference between my pre-COVID scenario and the single hit scenario amounts to 163 billion less GDP. So that is the impact of the single hit COVID scenario vis-a-vis the no COVID scenario. If we are a bit more conservative and we want to assume the two hit scenario of minus 9.8 and then plus 2.3%, and then assume that GDP converges to 2% all the way to 2027, then the GDP shortfall between these two turn of events, the no COVID and the double hit COVID scenario, amounts to 223 billion. So with that, I want to highlight that all these numbers that everybody produces, the OECD has two scenarios, we at Piraeus Bank have two, the European Commission has other scenarios, the European Central Bank, the IOBE has similar scenario. I don't think that because these numbers are so outside our comfort zone, we don't really fully appreciate the impact that these numbers will have on the Greek economy, on the Greek society, and the Greek population. Of course, we should keep in mind that these are scenarios. It's not destiny. So I think that these numbers, like a GDP shortfall between 160 to 220 billion euros, in a sense, highlight the degree of responsibility of policymakers, either in Brussels or in Athens, and the effort that they must put in order to engineer higher growth rates, which is the only way to limit the impact of COVID on the Greek economy and the Greek society. So that's my first point. The other 2 points are basically very closely interrelated. And one has to do with the level of bank lending rates that are mentioned in the OECD report, and especially in figure 114. And the last one has to do with this idea of an investment-led growth that is also mentioned in the report. Going first to bank lending rates, when I saw figure 114, my first reaction was, at last, somebody is willing to discuss the issue of cost of funding and cost of lending in the Greek economy. Since 2009, 2010, there have been extensive reports about the Greek economy by almost every economy in the world. There have been reports about analysis about demographics, competitiveness, productivity, the labor market, the current account, this, that, education, everything under the sun. But there has been very little discussion about the cost of money in the Greek economy. And if you spend some time looking at figure 114, you will see that at the peak of the Greek crisis, the cost of funding for Greek corporates was close to 6.5% nominal. At the same time, you have to take into account the fact that back then we had, even now, we have deflation, we have negative rates of inflation in the Greek economy. So real interest rates in the Greek economy were running close to plus 8% all that period. You have to compare this situation to what the rest of the developed economies were trying to engineer. Everybody else in the developed world were trying to basically engineer zero nominal rates and negative real rates in the hope of stimulating growth and investment. So, you know, nobody is willing to basically discuss the fact that, you know, okay, in Greece, we were forced to have a very tight, a very restrictive fiscal policy for the reasons that we all know. But at the same time, we had monetary conditions that were just crushing the Greek private sector. And I think that the fact that we had so high cost of money all these years in the Greek economy contributed substantially to the duration and the intensity of the Greek crisis. And that brings me nicely to my last point, which is the need for investment to stimulate growth in the Greek economy. I think that
Ilias, if you may try to make this last point very quick so that we can have time.
Yes, and the report very rightly highlights the issue that, you know, banks must finance the investment in the Greek economy. And I have no problem with that. The fact that I work for a bank, that doesn't mean that I don't recognize the fact that Greek banks have a problem performing their role in the Greek economy. But I think that that is only part of the question or of the issue. I think that if you try to estimate an investment function, or if you try to discover the factors that are driving investment in any economy, you will have to come up with two factors. The first is real rates, and I made my point about that just now. And the second driving factor, even the most important driving factor, is domestic demand. If you are in a business that depends on global demand, for instance, if you are in the business of producing gold, and we have one company in Greece who is mining gold in the north of Greece, then you truly don't care about the level of domestic demand, because you have a global market to sell your product. Or even if you're in a tourism area, in a touristic area that depends only on foreign tourists, that's fine as well. But it's not fine for any other sector or any other area in Greece. The businessman, the corporates, in order to commit to investment, they need to make sure that there is demand for the product that they're going to produce. And I think that is the reason, and I'm going to close with that statement, that private sector, non-financial, non-residential investment is a lagging macroeconomic variable. So putting too much emphasis on private investment to spearhead growth in any economy sounds to me like putting the cart before the horses. And we really need to think about other factors that can kind of kickstart growth, and then private sector investment will follow. That's all I wanted to say. And with that, I will pass the hypothetical microphone back to Nikos to continue the moderation of the panel.
Thank you, Ilias. So I think you made some very good points, focusing especially on the side of capital and investment. which I guess makes it now perfect that we pass to Daphne, who I think is going to focus more on the labor side of things. You need to unmute. Daphne, we still can, okay, now. We still cannot hear you. Not yet. Let's try Daphne once more. I don't think we can hear you, although you are unmuted. So maybe we can try again. In the meantime, before we can have Daphne on, can I convey a question that we got from one of the participants, but I think it's anyway important, perhaps to Mauro, before Daphne joins us again. There was this key point about the size of Greek businesses that you made. And actually, let me see, Daphne, are you still on?
I am here. I've been here all along.
Okay, so let's go to Daphne, and then I'm going to ask about the size of Greek businesses afterwards. So just keep it a little bit compact, if you may.
Okay, so good afternoon to everybody. I hope you can hear me. I would also like to thank IOBE for inviting me and OECD for the report. OECD economic surveys are always full of interesting information, useful information and policy recommendations. And the OECD Economic Survey of Greece for 2020 is no exception to that. Now, one of the things that makes the OECD surveys useful is their attempt to provide information that is comparable across countries. And that is, I think, much appreciated, because then you know where you stand in the world. But in order to say, to introduce some criticism, I'd like to say that this might sometimes work in a sort of negative direction if we don't recognize the idiosyncratic features of some countries. And this is what I would like my comments to reflect on. Some of the preconditions for the recommendations that the OECD makes, I think, have not been emphasized enough. So, for example, starting with the need to enhance R&D. One of the major shortcomings for the lack of R&D in Greece is the lack of data. Nobody seems to care about the fact that consistent, long-term economic data is not available to do any kind of analysis. So, for example, we cannot evaluate the effect of the change in the minimum wage. We cannot evaluate the effect of the introduction of a youth minimum wage and a number of other issues. The second point in which preconditions, I think, have not been taken into account is regards digital skills. Now, it was mentioned that Germany lacks infrastructure, but so does Greece. Greece lacks infrastructure in a big way, and that's one of the main reasons for which digital skills are not pervasive in the economy. And my third point has to do with the quality of education. The quality of education depends to a large extent on the quality of those teaching, and there is no recommendation made in improving the quality of the teachers. Now there's two more points in which I think there's been little discussion. One is a regional dispersion. Greece is has substantial regional variations in economic performance, which are not touched upon. And the issue of brain drain is very little commented upon. The one final point, just to make it short, comes in contradiction with what Ilias, Lekkos just mentioned. I find that the report stresses the labor supply side too much and not the labor demand side too much, enough rather. And if I were to recommend something on the Greek economy, I would recommend more investment from the private sector. And that doesn't necessarily mean that banks have to lend at cheaper rates. But for example, economic policy could be such that it encourages investment via, for example, increased depreciation. If investment does not increase in the private sector, I find it very difficult to understand how labor demand will increase. Now, and finally, on the reforms issue, one or two issues that I would like to see in a future report perhaps is to understand why reforms have not been pursued in some sectors, but have been pursued in others. And what I think would convince individuals to undertake reforms is to try and understand what the response to what the impact of COVID-19 would have been on the economy of Greece in 2010. In my view, the impact of COVID in 2010 would have been much more dramatic than it is now, because no reforms had taken place then. So that, I think, would persuade people of the value of undertaking reforms. That's all. Thank you very much.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Daphne. We have, I guess, 10, perhaps 12 minutes to discuss a little bit. I would like to raise 3 quick issues and perhaps see if any of the 5, the 3 presenters and the 2 discussants would like to have very quick comments. And let me start with this issue that both Daphne and Ilias mentioned, investment. In some sense, they're both right. Investment is not something that you can order, as Ilias said. On the other hand, as Daphne indicated, unless you create by priority an environment where private investment can also increase, you are in trouble in terms of GDP growth. So maybe let's start with either Alvaro or Mauro. Investment in Greece right now, total investment looks like it's stuck at about less than 12% of GDP, which is about half of the European and OECD average, if I'm not mistaken. And what is more worrisome is that back in the days when Greece used to invest similar, like a quarter of its GDP, 2/3 of that was in housing, which has collapsed. So how plausible is, and what can be a time scale for bringing up investment substantially when at the same time you cannot necessarily go back so much to housing investment, but you have to do more corporate investment? There is this investment gap. Is the reforms plan you are suggesting enough for this investment gap to be covered at a reasonable time?
I can start perhaps more and then can complement. Well, listen, when we talk about investment, there are 2 components, of course, public investment and private investment. In terms of public investment, what we say in the survey is that public investment is historically low, right? So 2% of GDP, really low. I think it's a major, obviously it's a consequence of the crisis. In every single country that had a substantial crisis in the last 10 years, especially the European ones that we discussed before, the easiest way to cut expenditures, get public investment, or you use structural funds to the maximum, but you try not to spend any money. And so, but virtually, in every single country that was affected by the financial crisis, the first, in terms of economic policies, the first thing to do was to cut public investment. So right now, you have a leeway that did not have before. And more importantly, you are going to have perhaps the means with the European recovery funds and with the new structural funds packages, you'll have some means to go back to invest in some public investments that did not do before. This does not mean that you should concentrate or you should do, go back to the mistakes made in the past, and I'm saying not only in Greece, but in many other countries. Certainly in my country, in Portugal, we decided to build roads all over the place, highways. You go to Portugal, fantastic highways, 2 or 3 highways to go to Lisbon, between Lisbon and Porto and so on, which was, in my view, a waste of money. And so I think, what do you need to do in terms of public investment? Concentrate what you need. It's digital, it's some infrastructure that is still important, but basically try to see where can I, improve the competitiveness of the Greek economy going forward. I think that's the most important part of the public investment. And on the other hand, it's the private investment. How can you, as this is what we're saying, Nicolitsas, how can you basically kickstart investment? Obviously, the first, in every single crisis, the first measure or the first variable that goes down and goes sharper down is usually investment. And so how can you bring investment back? Partly by restoring confidence, of course, easier said than done, but as soon as you restore confidence, that helps. But this is what we focused so much in the survey of, barriers to entrepreneurship, barriers, simplifying regulations, and so on, because we believe that in services and in a few other sectors, you still have really large barriers to entry, and so less barriers or barriers to competition, basically, but also regulations are too complex. And so if I'm going to start a factory in Greece, and then I look at the indicators from the World Bank and the IMF and especially and obviously the OECD, and I think, well, Greece perhaps not there yet in terms of regulation, perhaps too complicated. And so I might not be able to invest there. I do think that the decrease in corporate tax rates that was undertaken recently, plus some changes that we did in terms of tax regimes, plus if you now invest in debureaucratizing, reducing the bureaucracy in Greece, I think that will attract a lot more investment.
Okay.
Easier said than done, but I think I would go that way. I'm not sure if Mauro wants quickly to add.
Actually, let me complement the previous question with another one for Mauro in the interest of time that we got from one of the participants. Actually, let me ask, since I mentioned time, Alvaro, Mauro, and Tim, we are running close to the time we should be finishing. Could you extend your participation by about 10 minutes, or that would not be feasible?
Sure.
Okay. So Mauro, picking on what Alvaro mentioned about private investment, but connecting this to this issue of the size of firms, you made this like a central point that very small size firms and self-employment is a very large part of the Greek economy, and then there are two apparently contradictory ways to go about it. One is that this is so important that you should take care of it. And unless you pay particular attention and make sure that funding goes to that part of the economy, growth cannot come. And then there is another view which says that if you channel all of your funds in that, how can you get out of the problem and have the average size of the firm increasing over time? Are these contradictory? How are you thinking about this?
Well, we are thinking about this probably, in following two perspectives. One probably is a structural perspective that is also built around the concept of advantage that we are familiar with as economists, okay, even if the general public may not. Greece comparative advantage was based in the past on this kind of industries that rely on small firms, okay? To a large extent, the construction, tourism, accommodation, restaurant, and so on and so forth. Now, the great financial crisis, even the COVID crisis, will have a big impact on these sectors. It's very unlikely that the construction sectors will recover to the level that we've seen before. So there is the need for Greece to try to build or to diversify its industry base by building new sources of comparative advantage. This doesn't mean obviously undermining the role of tourism in the economy, because it contributes a lot. It has contributed in the past a lot, but it means trying to build comparative advantage in other industries where also firms of larger dimensions are more likely to appear. All this kind of process is not going to happen in 1 year, in 2 years, in 3 years. It's a very long-term process that will require consistent policies in what was already mentioned before, R&D, education, Daphne mentioned rightly education, and human capital to try to build those competencies, manufacturing, biomedical, pharmaceutical, where already Greece showed some good results. So that's on the long term. On the long term, obviously, it was mentioned before, I mean, it will be important to sustain demand over the short term and medium term. But also in this sense, I mean, government policies may have an important role through, for instance, improving the targeting of social protection scheme that may help to increase the purchasing power of lower income people. All this may sustain demand, and with the right policies on the supply side, may favor the emergence of larger firms in different sectors than before, like manufacturing, biomedical services, and so on and so forth. I would think in this way.
In some sense, there is a logical continuation in this, and I see that Tim wants to say something. But let me add the labor dimension, because Mauro basically says that if you look at a lot of the sectors where employment was coming from in the last decade or 2 or 3, like tourism, retail trade, hospitality, etc., housing construction, the size of firms there tended to be small. And now as you're shifting to other sectors, then we're going to see a gradual improvement on that front. But then there is the issue of unemployment and how fast you can sustain this transition. So Tim, you showed us some interesting graphs. Can we expect that people will be able to support this movement from some sectors towards other sectors? Are they ready for this? Are we lacking in digital or other skills? Do we need like training programs? Do we need a different tax system? Because you talked about the tax wedge. Is in your view, is the current structure of this wedge, meaning social security and taxation, is it there to support the transition we need?
So the way I wanted to answer this is to address the point about the trade-off between supply side and demand side policies at this point in the cycle, where in the survey we really emphasize the importance of active labour market policies. So measures that can help people better find jobs, help employers find employees that match with the skill profile that they need, but also access to training programs. If you look at the literature across countries, right now in the depths of the recession, it's the best time to be investing in training programs, in reskilling the workforce. So these are policies which have a long-term supply side benefit by boosting people's skills, boosting their productivity. But cyclically, now is the time to be boosting the capacity of those programs, giving people access to retraining programs. What we're likely to see then as well when we come out of the shock is that there's going to be more demand, or the sectors which are likely to do better are the sectors which demand the skills which are relatively weak in Greece. So the point about digital skills, for example. And already we see in Greece that there's this small sector of very innovative internet-type startups that have been doing well, but it's small. For that example of the sector which can help the Greek economy diversify, what's needed there is a larger workforce which has the skills that people need. So that's part of the answer.
Okay. Actually, I would like to give the opportunity to Daphne and Ilias in case they want to ask any direct questions. in addition to what they said. But I did get one of the questions in the comments. I think you rightly stressed in the survey that part of the current shock has to do with how exposed Greece is in tourism. Do you have an estimate about how important that is? In other words, what do you think as a share of the economy this hit is going to be this year? Or is this kind of too specific to estimate? I don't know if Mauro...
Tim, do you want to probably Tim has his numbers on his head about this?
So we know that, for example, the statistic that gets circulated widely is that about 1 in 5 workers in Greece work in the tourism sector either directly or indirectly. If we look at, so when we did the projections that were presented here, we had assumed that there would be a reasonable pickup in tourism activity with the reopening by now, effectively, by July, August. That activity would be rising, it wouldn't be back to where it would be normally, but it would be rising back to where it would normally be. You look at aircraft arrivals, the high frequency indicators, we're way short of that at this point. And so this is a sector which is the source of incomes for a fifth of the workforce, where those incomes are likely to be significantly weaker than they would be normally. You could do the math to see the size of the potential impact that's going to have on the household incomes across the country. Okay. And you can see well corroborated in the, so Elstat is producing some really nice releases that look at the impact of or the change in turnover by different sectors which are being affected by this crisis. And if you look at their latest release with the turnover in accommodation in May, that's consistent with this sector not picking up yet.
Okay. So let's do the following. Let's see if Ilias or Daphne have any final comments / question. Then I have mine of my own. But as we get towards the end, I also want to give the opportunity to George Krevellakis, our Greece's ambassador to the OECD, to say a couple of words. So let's start with Ilia. Anything specific?
No, thanks. I'm fine. It was a very interesting presentation, and I don't want to take up any more of your time. Thank you very much.
Daphne, are you somewhere?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. Yeah, this was a very interesting presentation. I just don't want to be unfair, perhaps, and I take into account what Tim said about active labour market policies, and I do acknowledge the emphasis put on this. There's just one point, perhaps, that I didn't mention when I was discussing this. In terms of Greek active labour market policies, there has never been any evaluation of their success or otherwise. So it would seem like a short-term measure that we introduce in order to spend some money and, yes, enhance demand, but it's never done with the long-term prospect of introducing these people into the labor market. And unless it's done this way this time, I think the failure would just show up a few years later. Yeah, that's all. Thanks very much.
Thank you, and I would agree with you that the full restructuring of unemployment, of how we tackle unemployment, including active labor market policies, is completely imperative. Before I give a final word to Ambassador Krevellakis, let me stick a little bit to one point. And of course, after I thank the OECD for allow us to host this interesting discussion, as well as for the collaboration in various forms the last few years. Let me try to inject a little bit of optimism. This is a big hit in the global economy, but I don't think it is necessarily the path over the next several years that we are going to be sluggish in terms of growth. Some people might have longer memories, might, if they go back and try to think about the direct hit, perhaps there is some resemblance to the oil crisis of the late 70s. And then after 2 or 3 years, dealing with basically debts and deficits, we got into, I guess, what we economists call the great moderation, about 25 years of growth, which was on top of technology progress, more integration of economies, and then regulatory environment becoming more friendly to business, and integration also of the Asian economies. Is it possible that thinking about the current problems, we are missing we should be spending perhaps more time thinking that the opportunity is there to get on a higher growth path overall, and how to better position our economies for that to happen, which has to do with closer collaboration, with pushing for technology. Alvaro, I don't know, this is perhaps a strange question, but I thought I would add a little bit of optimism.
Sounds good. Listen, I would like to answer very quickly also to questions that Ilias and Daphne asked. So very quickly, first of all, Ilias focused a lot on something on the interest cost to firms, right? So, and why Greece also was disproportionately affected compared to other countries. It was just very costly, partly because of what was happening in the public sphere. SMEs and companies in Greece were just paying too much higher interest, and it would be very difficult to invest at the time. And I think the big difference from the past and now is that now the ECB is helping you before it wasn't. And I think you'll start seeing more and more a decline in the cost for businesses. And I think this is good news for Greece. But I will be happy to discuss this in another occasion. But I really think this is a massive, massive advantage compared to the past crisis, okay? And this was, I think, I totally agree with Ilias, this was a major problem. Second, Daphne was asking, why do reforms happen in some sectors and not in others? Well, the answer is vested interests. And sometimes in some sectors, it's extremely difficult to change anything. I remember when I was in charge and we had to do a change in professional services, the chief of lawyers came to me, and we are just doing small things like introducing more competition, allowing, for example, non-lawyers to be involved in the lawyers' offices, and to do publicity. And the guy called me, he said, listen, you understand that what you're trying to propose here is, not even Salazar, who was our dictator, had the guts to do it. And I thought, okay, if this is such a minor thing, and this guy is reacting this way, then you understand why some reforms in many countries don't happen, right? So I really think, first of all, you need to pick up your battles, right? So you cannot go against every single interest group at the same time. This was a big mistake done by the Troika, because the adjustment programs were done and was designed by bureaucrats in Brussels very often. And they thought, okay, they saw all the indicators from the OECD and from the World Bank. Let's tackle everything at the same time. You cannot do this when you do a reform program. You have to select, pick up your fights. So see where you can win and see where you cannot win. And so, but you need to do the reforms gradually. So I think this is it. So I think you need to first identify where are the biggest gains for you in terms of reforms, and then afterwards you go against vested interest that you think will really make a difference in terms of having more competition. So I think that explains part of your answer. And going back to finally to your question, Nikos, are we going towards a higher growth path? I think there's a possibility of that happening, right? So I don't think there is. So we know that productivity has been falling fairly dramatically in the last few decades, not only years, decades. Perhaps digital will help us revive parts of productivity that we did not have before. I also think that countries like Greece now have and Portugal and many others have something that they did not have before, which is this crisis shows that having critical production in only one country, such as China, is highly counterproductive for firms. So they will start choosing one or two other locations for that critical production. This opens an opportunity for countries like Greece. If you are attractive enough, if you are less bureaucratic, if you are, have some competitiveness in terms of tax and the fiscal system, then you can tell countries or companies that will get out of China and other countries and say, listen, come to Greece. You'll be welcome here, and you can export to other countries from this wonderful, beautiful country where the weather is fantastic. And I think this is the sort of thing you can bring better growth prospects for Greece. And I sincerely hope this is the case, because I really think you're a fantastic country, you deserve it. And, after all the sacrifices of the last 3 years, you need a few lucky breaks as well going forward. And certainly you especially need a lot of investment. And so that's why maintaining a reform state of mind, not the austerity, but reforming education, reforming bureaucracy and so on is key in the next few years.
Alvaro, thank you very much for these remarks. Let me just add that, the infamous ownership that reforms will have, but as you said, sequencing and picking your battles is very important. Thank you, of course, for the presentation, but overall for the collaboration. Likewise, of course, to Mauro and team. A last word by Ambassador Pereira, perhaps?
Thank you very much, Nickos. First of all, thank you for organizing this discussion, which really gave us the opportunity to enlarge, to exchange. It was extremely interesting. The reason I wanted to take the floor is say a few words about our collaboration in preparing this review. Many people have said that this is probably one of the best economic reviews of Greece, and I have the feeling that the discussion this evening is confirming this idea. And I believe that the success, in spite, of course, of the great difficulty of the coronavirus, since the moment we were ready to present the review, we had to stop and start again and adapt. But what I would like to say is that I think the success is due to the fact that we work together very well. I mean, first of all, of course, the Greek desk and Alvaro was extremely helpful and very supportive. And of course, Mauro team, I mean, all the people, it was really very, very, very helpful. And then the SOE and Michael Argyroux, and we from the Greek delegation, we worked very well together. And it was really extremely pleasant, this cooperation with our exchanges. So I really wanted to stress this way of working. I think it is a major element of success, the very good teamwork. We did have a very good teamwork. And obviously, I mean to express my thanks to everybody. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, George. I guess unless any of the 5 speakers has a final word, I guess this is the time to thank everybody.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody. The report is obviously now posted online, and further discussion and hopefully not only discussion, but action is going to follow. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Good day.
Thank you, Nikos. Thank you. Bye-bye to everybody.